Hey there, welcome. This is yet another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast. And this is quite an unusual episode in that it's really was never intended to be a standalone podcast episode. This is actually an excerpt from a relatively new offering from not the Poetry of Predicament podcast, which of course has been my long-standing podcast in support of people who are brave enough to be facing into the human-caused collapse of Earth and human systems. This is a new offering from my website, which is the livingresilience.net website, and the programs page, which is called Deep Academy. And what all that means is that I've really, starting a couple of years ago, have finally given birth, so to speak, to this series of video learning series. Call them Deep Academy. And it's something of a play on words, riffing off of the term deep adaptation that was coined a couple of years ago by academic from the UK, Jem Bendell. And since its inception, I've been a volunteer moderator on Jem Bendell's Deep Adaptation Forum. And it's been a place where people of like mind or like interest or professional focus can come together and explore this elusive set of inner skills and capacities that could be called the inner work of deep adaptation in the face of current and imminent collapse of Earth and human systems. So they're on the website, on the programs page called Deep Academy. You will find a number of learning series, each of them approximately 3 or 4 20-minute, maybe half-hour long primary videos. Then a number of other supporting media, including videos, audios, articles, you know. And each of those learning series will have a document, a downloadable document to invite you to participate in journaling, note-taking, focused experimentation with various self-assessment tools and so on to support the learning and growing that's implied in each of the learning series. So this particular episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast is again one element, one of those primary videos from one of those learning series. This one could easily be seen as the third series. The first one, if you decide to go to the website and then go to the Deep Academy page and kind of scroll down, you'll see that there's really an introductory series. It's called Living in Two Worlds. Living in Two Worlds is meant to be hopefully useful for someone who's brand new to the whole concept that we are living in collapse now, and we have more to come quite soon. And it's also intended to be equally useful for a person who's been around this conversation for quite some time. I know that I've run this by a number of people who've been in that conversation for upwards of a decade or more. And they have also reported tremendous value in the conversation as presented for exploration in that initial Living in Two Worlds experience. This particular episode that we're about to watch, which I should mention, and you already know since it was in the title, is an in-depth conversation with Deb Ozarko. Deb Ozarko is a blogger and an author, and at one time was quite a podcaster in her own right. And she's also what I would consider an advanced practitioner in the inner skills that are sometimes called deep adaptation, the kind of skills that expand an inner, not only the skill set, but the capacity to be present to life, even in the face of extraordinary circumstances and stressors. I invite you to enjoy this conversation. Please be aware, it implies something of a setup and an understanding, not only of Deb's in-depth work, which you might want to wait until you've read her book Beyond Hope to dive into this conversation. You'll still find value. I think it still convey a tremendous amount, no matter where you are in this conversation, and no matter how much of Deb's work you've experienced. But what I'm inviting you to do here is to just get a sense of what being in the midstream process of any of these learning series can feel like. This is the longest and most in-depth of any of the series segments that I've yet produced. I really intended it that way. And so what I can tell you, even if you haven't started any of the learning series yet, by the time you get to this series on hope, I think you should be ready. It implies quite a bit of personal work and introspection and experiments in taking on new ways of thinking and being. It also implies a tremendous amount of courage. The exploration of who will we be together in the face of the collapse of Earth and human systems is easily the most important and difficult conversation that humanity's ever had to face. And the exploration of hope and how it fits into this big picture also is an extraordinary challenge, requiring extraordinary courage to do the level of introspection that is being asked in this series. So you'll get a sense of that. Thank you for joining us in this deep dive conversation about hope with author and remarkably inspiring human being, Deb Ozarko. And I look forward to seeing you in future on-demand video learning series here in Living Resilience Deep Academy. Hope, an online video learning series from Living Resilience Deep Academy. Growing beyond our insane collective identity. A quote from Eckhart Tolle in 3 parts. 1 part for each of the 3 primary videos of this series. Part 1, recognizing the insanity of our global culture. It can be painful at first to suddenly wake up and realize that the collective you had identified with and worked for is actually insane. Some people at that point become cynical or bitter and henceforth deny all values, all worth. Segment 2, trying to replace one collective identity with an even more dangerous one by refusing to acknowledge the collapse. This means that they quickly adopted another belief system when the previous one was recognized as illusory and therefore collapsed. They didn't face the death of their ego, but ran away and reincarnated into a new one. A collective ego is usually more unconscious than the individuals that make up that ego. For example, crowds are capable of committing atrocities that the individual away from the crowd would not be. Segment 3, the possibility of creating an enlightened collective. Nations not infrequently engage in behavior that would be immediately recognizable as psychopathic in an individual. As new consciousness emerges, some people will feel called upon to form groups that reflect the enlightened consciousness. These groups will not be collective egos. The individuals who make up these groups will have no need to define their identity through them. They no longer look to any form to define who they are. However, constant alertness is required since the ego will try to take over. Enlightened collectives will fulfill an important function in the arising of the new consciousness. Just as egoic collectives pull you into unconsciousness and suffering, the enlightened collective can be a vortex for consciousness that will accelerate the planetary shift. Eckhart Tolle, from his book, A New Earth. I guess that's enough for this moment of checking in. And again, I would just invite you, if you have anything to share, to bring yourself here, great, or in response, great. And if not, then off we go.
Well, Dean, I totally understand where you're coming from. I feel this profound resonance with you. And I have from the very moment that we first connected several years ago. Mm. And so you've always had a very special place in my heart. And I have tremendous respect for the work that you do and the tremendous commitment, your ongoing commitment for persevering in these tumultuous times with this really expansive messaging that you're putting out there. Mm. So I feel really deeply honored to be here with you, and I'm very grateful that you've invited me. So thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Huh. Are we good to go?
Totally good to go.
So, there I was, creating this body of work. About what, you ask? Well, so I got these many pieces in place. I don't know, if you might have seen on the website, or I don't know if you're on my newsletter list or anything, but anyway, I've got a few things that I'm putting out. And one of them, of course, is the podcast. And the more recent offerings are an online, on-demand set of video learning series with a number of other kinds of media peppered into each one. And it's meant to at first be an introduction to what is the notion of collapse, what is the notion of this, facing in a bold and honest way the human-caused collapse of Earth and human systems, and to do that in as artful a way as I possibly can. I'm not really into traumatizing people or scaring them or that sort of thing, but that's the purpose of a recording like this with you. Is this is now the third offering in what will be dozens and dozens of these offerings that people will be able to see, okay, here's the place to start. They watch the 3 videos, they read the supporting materials, whatever, then they might go on to the next thing. And they see that they've got to focus on, they really want to learn more about this stuff about shadow. What is shadow? And so they can choose to go that direction. Or so that's what this talk is really a part of. And I think I've mentioned to you that this is about hope. That's the title of this particular little learning series. This series will have 3 main videos that are about 20 minutes to half hour long, where I speak a little bit and then I offer in various examples or quotes or video clips from other sources to amplify a particular point. And where this interview is going to want to go is in the final of 3 primary video segments in the Hope series. And the first one is basically in the realm of not so much the whole denier world, because that's a little bit out of my reach. I don't really even want to spend time there. But up from there, I want to be able to bridge people from what they assume is just the normal world. And so I'm giving some examples of what is it, you know, when you look at these clips that I'll play for them, what might you suspect that that person, how does that person define hope? If you're just doing some casual people watching on these clips, how might they define hope? And by the way, how do you define hope? And so on. So you get a sense of that's how it can be in the first 2 segments. The second segment is more for the average person who might even be somewhat of an activist or have at least some advanced knowledge of, like, wow, things are really going weird out there in the world. And I would like to be able to say I could hope for things, but sometimes it's hard. And so, you know, the usual mid-range grappling with how the world is going from some kind of barely informed, really no foundation kind of stance. And the third segment is pointing primarily to your work because you articulate it so beautifully. There are a couple of other sources that I'm drawing on, and why I'm so excited to speak with you is that you have indeed put together this huge expression through Beyond Hope. You know, and in it, you actually bridge for us an awful lot. And that's a big part of what the work I'm doing is just bridging into things that people don't know that they don't know about. You know, most of the people that I introduce to your book, they just don't know that they don't know what hope is. They have never taken the time to even define for themselves what does hope mean, much less what would a transformed, intentionally blown open definition of hope be, you know, per your writing.
Right.
And so I really am wide open. I don't absolutely need you to be expressing this stuff. What I'm thrilled to be on this call with you about is I know of no other place on the planet, and I look around a lot, and if you find any, you let me know, okay? I don't know of any other place where there are people are invited in to be exemplars who really have something to say about what it is to be out on a horizon that people don't even know that horizon is there.
Right,
Is that making sense at all?
Totally makes sense, yeah.
Okay, so I'm not expecting you, nor am I asking you to you know, meticulously map out the steps and what do you think and prescribe this and suggest that and so on. but I am asking if you would to just notice if you're moved to share any of your walking that territory, your, you know, having walked the path that you've walked,
Mhm.
you've now walked where most people on the planet have never been, and most of the people alive now will never be. And there's this small number of people that will experience this conversation and then perhaps your book and so on. And out of that, out of whatever I say, that out of your presence today, some number of people will resonate and will be enlivened in a way to start to look out in a way through their fog, like maybe there is a horizon I don't see now.
Mhm.
Maybe there is something, because there's something moving in me after I've heard this sharing. So I mean no pressure. I hope I'm not, you know, putting out some sort of pressurized message. I'm really just asking, and I'm saying, predicting that really just out of your natural sharing of where you are now, and to whatever degree you're moved to share anything about what got you here, this path that got you here, I'm asserting that that's going to be extraordinarily valuable for me and for the folks that will, some number of the people that will watch and listen to this. So first, does that communicate, and do you have anything to respond with?
Oh, I always do.
Yeah.
I love how you always leave such an expansive, wide open door, and I can just waltz through it however I please. And I'm just going to pick up on one of the threads that you mentioned earlier, and it was about how many people have not really explored what hope means, and they can't really define it for themselves. And I can honestly say that that is where I was several years ago. Actually, probably for most of my life. I was uh, I was just as committed to hopium as the everyday person, and it wasn't until, gosh, you know, it all seems like such a blur now, so it's really hard for me to pinpoint dates anymore. But I think it was around like 2014, 2015 that I was called out on the way I was expressing myself on my website by a listener who very pointedly said to me that my message was filled with hopium, that ecosystems were dying, that the ocean was dying, that, and it just, she listed it on and on. And at that time, I was skirting the edges of expressing that message in my work, but I hadn't fully gone there yet. And quite honestly, I actually had fear because I didn't want to lose my podcast listener base and my blog base. You know, I had worked hard to build that up. And when she called me out, my initial response was irritation. And I always take that as a red flag within me, that when I feel irritated, it means that somebody has touched on something that I need to explore within myself. Because it's always about me. It wasn't about her. It's easy to make it about somebody else. You irritate me. But she provoked a feeling of irritation within me that I decided to explore. And I knew that she was right. And so from there, I allowed myself to really finally fully explore the depth of what she meant about all of this collapse unfolding within myself. And from there, yeah, I fell apart, and my message changed dramatically then. And that was the first time in my life that I'd heard the term hopium.
Huh. Yeah.
It's a very annoying term.
Uh-huh.
It was for me at least then, but now I can certainly see that that was the way I was. I was, and when I look back at that time, and I look back at what hopium meant for me back then, it meant that I was grasping for something outside of me to prevent me from exploring that depth of the pain that I was about to touch by letting go of hope. And so that led to this entire exploration of definitely my inner world. But I was also at that point, I was living in coastal British Columbia, and I was noticing dramatic ecosystem collapse out there. I was noticing the starfish that were just wasting away in the ocean. I was noticing red tides. There was this green ocean event that happened in 2015. It was all about the ocean. And at the same time, I was starting to have dreams, vivid dreams and premonitions about the ocean that were really haunting me. And so that hopium provocation was really what it took to send me over the edge into the other paradigm that I was not quite fully stepping into. So the way I see hope now, let's just start with that exploration. The way I see hope now, I see that there's nothing tangible in the word hope. There's no creative force behind it that inspires anything meaningful. And with so many people who choose hope as their way of being, what I've noticed is that there seems to be a couple of different ways that it generally expresses itself. So the first one is the one that's most common. I find that there's blindly carrying on with business as usual, often filled with hope that things will magically change on their own. So I feel like that's pretty well the status quo. And then another expression is railing against an immutable system with the hope to create some semblance of incremental change. And that would be the path of activism. And what I've discovered over the years is that as a longtime activist, is that my point of power is not in fighting against or railing against an unchanging system for a future that I have no control over. My point of power is in being deeply intimate with myself in each unfolding moment and living that in its full expression. And so that was really the journey that I went on to really discover more about myself. And in that, there's no need for hope in that. And so that's where I stand. And what I discovered through this journey is this more liberating option, which is hope-free. And so in this, sorry, did you have something to say there?
I do. I'm sorry to stop you, but I know that you really know this territory, and I so appreciate you sharing it with us. If you don't mind, I'd like to just slow down and loop back and
Sure.
just tease apart a couple of the pieces for people who are new to these distinctions, because you've already covered a lot of ground. And for some people, it's kind of like to even think about the first, like, defining hope. What do you mean? Hope is hope. I mean, what
Right.
So I'd like to actually just contrast what you've just shared as the kind of early levels of defining hope that you've experienced and you see in others. I'd like to offer you a couple of my own, and I'd like to just kind of banter a bit with you about that initial level of using the word hope, just so we have something to contrast of, because before we get to the area that you're about to go to. Okay. So there are two really common. I was just telling you that there are three segments in this hope series, in this particular learning series that I'm doing. And the first one is really at the most basic level. And I've asked literally hundreds of people from all walks of life about how do you define hope? And while very few of them used exactly these words, it seemed like something like this was in the subtext when they would try and come up with a definition on the spot. It was something like, gee, I hope the experts come up with answers to these pesky problems so that we can get back to business and life as usual. And as soon as possible would be great. And by the way, if we could stop hearing these stupid polar bear stories, that would be great too. So
Right.
I'm being a little snarky at the end, but not too far off from what, you know, a lot of people are driven to say about it. So I'm noticing, if I try and compare with what I can remember you talking about, there is there's no agency, there's no reference to, if it's me speaking, there's no reference to my causation of my own experience. Like
Exactly.
who I
Yes.
am is a consumer. Who I am is a very familiar part of the machinery of this business as usual human operating system. And everything that I am hoping will stop or go away, or that I get more of, is all referenced in this business as usual human operating system. It's all, how much of it I get from this, how much do I have to work to get that. I know you know what I'm talking about, but I just,
Yes.
again, I'm
Yes.
wanting to get
Yeah.
super obvious about these kind of earlier, simpler versions of the word hope. The other one is not a whole lot different, but it's in Derek Jensen's very typical, articulate, and he has his own great, unique way of describing things. He also came up with an article quite a bit before you wrote your book, I think, that he called Beyond Hope. And his definition actually came out of a number of his talks in which he invited the audience to help him define what is hope. And what they came up with is it's desiring something about which we have no agency. So desiring some outcome, some aspect of life to occur, and a precursor to it is we have no agency. Because, for instance, I'm not going to hope that I take a breath in a moment, because I just do. I don't have this lack of agency driving me to hope for something. So thank you for sitting through all that. I just wanted to put a little more detail into those more basic or early versions of hope that I hear an awful lot of. And so moving from those basic earlier definitions, there was one other piece that I just want to start to add a bit of detail to also, and I'm hoping you are holding that thread that I stopped you in just a few moments ago. It's because we're going to get back there. The one piece that I've heard you imply, even in your sharing up till now, is that there's been an extraordinary role of an importance of the ability to let go.
Yes.
To let go at an ever deeper level, if I might add. So here I'm just adding a little bit of my own sharing, my own process, if I can, just kind of compare notes with you as we're cruising along this pathway. It actually has not ceased to amaze me since my very first meditation. I can remember my very first meditation instruction, some more than 40 years ago, 45 years ago. And I thought, when they would tell me something about, well, and one part of this meditation practice is you'll notice the opportunity to let go instead of holding on to something and blah, 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 that sort of thing. And I thought I had a pretty good notion about it. you know, 16 years
Yeah.
old. And then I thought I had a pretty good notion on it when my mind got blown at the next level 5 years later, and then 5 years beyond that, and so on. It's been punctuated.
It never ends, Dean.
Right. I
Doesn't.
got it. So I'm just wanting to make note of that as we, co-create this kind of walking along the pathway of this journey, and compare notes if that works. And again, I don't know. Are you comfortable sparking back up?
Absolutely.
Okay, good job then. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, what you're talking about with hope and Derek Jensen's brilliant essay about that, which I have read, and he is a gifted writer, and he
Yeah.
articulates it extremely well. There is no agency in hope. It's all external referencing for somebody else to fix the mess. And honestly, I actually find it quite amazing how much power we bestow on words like hope, because there's when you think about the word hope, it has its own, I don't know, it's put up on a pedestal by a lot of people. They use it a lot in a way that they believe it has power, but it actually doesn't. I mean, there's no wind beneath the sails of that word. So the way I see hope now, with the clarity that I have all of these years later, it would be like to actually pick up on a sailing metaphor. It's like the doldrums. It just aimlessly drifts around in the middle of the ocean with no wind in sight. And hope is that wish for wind that never appears. That's kind of the way I see it now. So, that's going back to that agency thread that you were talking about.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and it's really, we're so entranced as a culture into believing that hope really has a lot of power. But when you really look at it, when you look at it carefully and you listen to how, really just feeling how it comes out in expression, it just goes, it's like fluff. There really is no personal ownership or no personal power in that.
Yeah.
So I think that when we allow ourselves to there's such power in language, when we turn the mirror around in our expression of hope and we actually look at it carefully, you can see that it really is meaningless. And so, do you want me to go back to the hope-free part now?
Sure.
Because I'm ready.
Yeah, great. Rock and roll.
So going back to what I was talking about earlier, is I've reached this place, and then picking up again on what you were talking about, letting go, through the process of letting go, which is not at all an intellectual exercise. I mean, we can talk about letting go intellectually as much as we want, but as you very well know, it's a deeply visceral, very painful process of undoing psychic roots that have been deeply embedded in belief systems that drive us. So yes, it's a mental letting go, but it's not that easy because it is so visceral and it is so painful.
Yeah.
And so much of it is invisible, running behind the scenes of our awareness. And that's, when you talk about letting go, and like 5 years later, you think you're a finished product, and then all of a sudden all this stuff comes up again, and it's like, oh my God. And sometimes it comes in fits and spurts, and then sometimes it comes on like a relentless tsunami, wave after wave after wave. And that's what I've just been experiencing lately. Invisible threads that have been rooted into my psyche, that have been driving my expression in the world in ways that have been limiting, that I could not see at all until I could. And then, of course, once you see it, It's like, I don't want that in my life again. And then you go through that painful process of letting it all go. So to get to the place of hope free, there's a lot of letting go. And that's where I stand right now. And in this place of being hope free, what exists is a deep trust in the natural intelligence and the unfolding of life, which I capital L life, and life within myself and also outside of myself in ecosystems and the natural systems that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
So the caveat to becoming hope free and to have that exist within myself is for me to know myself as the essential being that I am. So you let me know if I'm going too fast again, because I'm going to start getting deep now, because that's my thing. I don't like to flirt around the edges. I just go deep.
I am going to stop you just for a moment, and please hold that thread, because we are going to go there. But once again, this is a lot. You've already gone a long way in this territory, and I want to be sure to recap for my own clarity and for folks who are watching this who might not be familiar with the territory. The second episode in this series, this being the third episode in the series on hope, the second one is a bit of mapping out of regular folks kind of in the middle of the conversation about hope. If on one end is folks so in denial and so unaware of the systemic nature of life and of this planet and the ecosystem and so on, that there's just nothing, it's like a non-issue. There's nothing to hope for. When they hope, they hope they go to Tahiti next year for their holiday. There's no there on the far end of that conversation. And then what I hear you speaking about and mapping out for us is your experience of what I would call the other end of the conversation. One that is
the extreme other end.
Right. That is a direct experience of, it's even insufficient for me to call it the systemic nature of life. It is just such a fullness of life. Perhaps it could be called the oneness of life and so on.
Yes.
That's that dimension, that's that direction. But in the middle is a whole lot of folks, and I'm really wanting to speak as highly as I can of people well-intended, want to be living life in a good way. They get out of bed each morning and just want to do the best they can for themselves, their loved ones, their communities, and so on. And even with all that being so, there are ways in which the expression of hope is a cornerstone of this construct that we've put together, those of us in this center zone, that the disturbance of that structure that I call myself and how I experience the world and how I presence myself in the world, it's actually, I'm holding it together with everything I can.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're talking about letting go, and boy, that's really difficult, and I thought it was all handled, and then this next wave come, and then the next wave. What I believe a part of what you're describing is, certainly in my experience of it anyway, is when I get a wave of life that is really an opportunity to let go of some of that holding structure that I've been holding on since I was very young.
Mm-hmm.
It can be, it is likely to be fraught with unconscious material.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
and I might be inclined to call it shadow material, both individual and collective shadow material, that meaning the aspects of myself or the aspects of our culture that I am not willing to be straight with. I'm not willing to admit to. I'm not wanting to see. I'm wanting to dismiss and keep it away. And by doing that, I am bringing it into more and more life. And I need to hold on more and more to try and keep it suppressed.
Mm-hmm.
Is that making sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So why I'm going to all this, and I thank you so much for your patience, because I really want to get to where you wanted to go. But a big part of this third and final episode in this learning series on hope is to know that there's a shadow side to hope. It can look like it's supposed to be all white picket fences and nicely trimmed lawns and everything's looking great, and we all hope for that. We hope for the best, and hope is so you just can't touch it. It's such a supposed to be such a virtue. And I'm asserting that there's actually a tremendous amount of shadow in our relatively shadow-driven world. We're literally driving ourselves and many other species to extinction. How much more shadow-driven do we need to be?
Yes, exactly.
If we just look at American and many other kinds of politics around the world, we can see that we have a deeply shadow-driven world going on. So I just wanted to mention that, and the roots that go deep from that shadow through the whole concept of hope in this middle range of the conversation. And for people who are just starting to do some work and become more aware of these shadow elements, and they could create another, perhaps a far more empowered definition of hope for themselves and so on, that there definitely will be many challenges, deep challenges
Mm-hmm.
on the path, walking this path that I hear you describing, and that I'm also bringing my rendition of the story, and that those can be extraordinarily painful. They can be grueling. They certainly have been for me in many, many episodes of it.
Yes.
I think that's what I'm hearing you describe, even in your recent, you've been describing some recent waves that you've been going through. I wanted to just go back, map out that territory and include the aspects of shadow, and that the depth of this work, the challenge of this work that it is to walk this path, it has been daunting for me, and I would not trade a moment of it. It has been the most life-giving element of my time being alive. So again, thank you so much for that, sitting through that recap. I'm curious if any part of that sparked you to want to respond, and if not, then please go straight into that depth that you wanted to go in before.
Oh, I'm willing to go all over the place.
All right.
That's the way I like to roll. Let's just be organic with this and flow. Well, what you were saying about the shadow side. That's not the terminology I use, but that's definitely, I understand what you mean.
Yeah.
And I remember writing specifically, I haven't read my own book in quite some time. I read it enough when I was in the editing process. But I do remember one very striking short sentence that I wrote that pretty well sums up the shadow aspect of hope. And I wrote that hope is denial in drag. So to me, that pretty well summarizes the shadow aspect of what I believe hope to be, because I saw that in myself. So the reason those words were able to come out to emerge from me was because I knew that in myself. And I recognized that, we create these psychic structures around the power that we give to this meaningless word, hope, that create almost barrier, like I mean, the way I'm listening to you and the way you were using your hands is, it's just, you were talking about how, you know, the structure that we create around ourselves for hope is almost uh, like a fence around us to prevent the penetration of the actual reality to merge into our being, so that we allow ourselves to feel the grief and to feel the hopelessness and to feel the despair and all of those emotions that arise when we allow ourselves to
Mhm.
just to let go of hope and to see beyond that. And I mean, there's stages, there's so many stages, like you were talking about. There's being filled with hope, and then it's like, hope isn't really working out for me, and starting to let the barricade of hope, the wall, the armor, that's the word I was searching for,
Mm.
the armor of hope, to undress the armor and to start allowing the deeper, more profound reality to enter. And that's when we go through that profound grieving phase. And
Yeah.
that profound grieving phase brings up a lot of the shadow aspects that you're talking about. Grief is like that. Grief is a process of falling apart.
Yeah.
And I know in my own life, I allowed myself to fall apart. It took a while to get there because, you know, I mean, falling apart is not fun. And like you, I mean, I would not trade that in for anything. And not only did I allow myself to fall apart once, it was over and over and over and over again, including very recently, like I just mentioned. And every time I emerged from that falling apart, that personal collapse, or what I now call an expansion crisis, I would feel myself feeling more grounded and more expansive in myself. And that's why I've just relabeled it expansion crisis. Because collapse, I mean, it feels like a collapse, but on the other side of it, and I'm sure you concur, is that there's more expansion on the other side.
Right.
So for me, what this falling apart looks like, it's about letting go of the resistance that creates that armor around who I once believed myself to be, and allowing the darkness, the despair, the grief, or, you know, whatever else comes up to totally envelop me, no matter how painful it is, and it always is. So in essence, what it's really all about doing the total opposite of what culture teaches us to do. It's about running into the darkness, running into the shadow, running into the pain, rather than doing everything possible to avoid it. So that's kind of where I feel like just pausing right now on
Yeah.
that part of the conversation that we were chatting about. And I guess I'll just leave it in your hands now.
Okay. So I'm just noticing a different expression on your face, and I'm just pausing for a moment to be with you in that. Yeah. Hmm. There's a particular state that is I'm present to quite a bit in our conversation and in many of our conversations before. And it's really kind of the primary or central state that I am really blessed to have pretty good access to in life. And I really didn't know what to call it. You know, things like Satori and Nirvana and so on, religious baggage with it. And I've never been a religious person and really didn't have the anchoring in direct experience with those traditions to be able to really use any of those words. And somehow in my own experience, and then in subsequent conversations with some, of all people, fundamentalist Christian people, and actually a couple of Muslim people who practice the Muslim religion, Islam. We ended up sharing with each other about what was the experience of great expansion and of a sense of unity with more and more around us. You know, we would try our best to put these into words, these experiences, and find a way to describe it to one another. And more, a whole bunch of times, it was called a state of grace.
Mm.
And so I've just come to call this grace. And what grace implies in any given moment is as fully as possible letting go into the moment.
Yes. Yeah.
And I wanted to just roll something by you. You just described one brief description that you included about grief is that it's a process of falling apart. And I definitely can relate to one aspect of grief in my experience being falling away of and falling apart of things that I am either used to or love or have held in an important way in my life. And there's another part of grief that doesn't seem to get talked about much. I do some grief counseling work. I'm a facilitator for a local grief facilitation organization. It's called Winter Spring here in Southern Oregon. And, you know, all too often it really is about the hard and loss and this aspect of a person has been torn away, and it's their process of coming to terms with that. And it can be long and rarely goes too far from just being excruciating for some long time. That's often that way. And I'm noticing that there's an aspect of grief that for me is also not that.
Yes.
That it is actually it's like a glowing ember from a fire. This warm, glowing, life-giving, and so much beauty. It almost seems like a little source of grace all on its own, this ember or this source of this grace experience and in grief. And it really comes from, I don't know a better word than honoring whatever it is that is now been taken away or that has been the loss.
Mm-hmm.
If it's the person or it's the aspect or it's the place or the animal or whatever it is. And there's so much beauty. And the tears are not tears of my pain for my loss. They're tears of beauty, tears of love. And they so quickly can turn to just peals of laughter. Mm-hmm. And then back to tears. And so on. So I just wanted to include that, again, to just add a little bit more detail from a different perspective, wide open to anything you might want to respond with or add in your own direction. I appreciate you bringing up grief. It is an essential part. We've both been bringing up about letting go. And I guess it's time to see if you're ready to pick up the thread again, or if you have any responses to what I've just shared.
Sure. Well, yeah, the grief conversation. I wrote an entire, very large chapter in my book, Beyond Hope, about grief as well. And uh, it's all of it. It is a very humbling process that uh, it is about letting go. From my perspective, it's about letting go of what we've been attached to. So like you said, whether it's a planet, an animal, the planet, an animal, a person, a thing. I mean, we grieve crazy things sometimes, but really,
Yeah.
grief is about letting go of attachment to something or someone. And again, it's a visceral, sorry, I got a cat's tail fluff by here. Drive-by cat. Uh, it, oh boy. It's the deep psychic roots again that weave their way into our minds that create this attachment that when we lose something or perceive a loss of something, that it makes the letting go so painful. And also at the same time, I find that, like what you were saying about grief, is that it can be very connecting as well, because we generally only grieve what we love or who we love. Yeah. And so in the grieving process, there is a profound sense of connection. And I feel like, I mean, from my own personal experience now, it's it's a kind of a slippery slope, because and I've noticed this in myself over the years, when I'm in a place of grieving or grief, sometimes I get a little too comfortable in that place because I love the feeling of connection. And that connection that I feel is really less about what I lost and more of a connection with myself. So it's kind of it's a covert way of self-connection that's not really super healthy in a sustained manner. So grieving for sure, as a process, and you know that it's not a process, it's not a linear process with a start and a finish. It's something that moves in and out constantly. But recognizing when I'm in a state of grief now, or in a place of grief, that it's something that I now have enough consciousness within myself to allow it to move rather than for it to land within me and create that self-connection. Because I've discovered another way to have that self-connection without feeling grief all the time. Yeah. Where I can feel joy, where I can feel everything, where I can feel angry and still feel self-connected, where I can feel really silly, I mean, just the whole range of human emotion. And I don't need to source grief to find that. So I just wanted to point that out from my own personal experience, and what you were talking about, that beautiful ember. I know that. And I also know myself getting stuck in grief. And I also know myself coming out of grief and still having that glowing ember within myself. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I thought that was important to bring up and just share my own personal experience. Just to be, our minds are so tricky. We can, it's so easy to grow roots in things that feel good, even if they're a little bit strange, like grief as a feel-good feeling. But the feel-good part of it is that self-connection that we're so desperately longing for. Yeah, thank you. Well, I don't know where you wanted to go next, but something that just bubbled up for me pretty strong while you were saying that is the vast majority of folks who are going to be participating in this particular learning series, any of the offerings,
here in the living resilience deep academy stuff. I love all these names. I try to put myself in their shoes. And certainly there's a part of me that is curious when someone like yourself, who has obviously walked a path and walked a path quite a bit further than many of us have, and you've seen some of the horizon that we don't even know is there yet. Perhaps you've been up to this next ridge or two, and you've seen some horizon, some other valleys, some other territory that we have not seen. And really, sometimes this becoming collapse aware can get kind of binary. We're pretty clear how screwed up this world is that we're in, and we're all very busy in it. We've all got our full plates and our full lives, and we're all engaged in doing what we're doing. And we just literally, when I hear a kind of a frilly, I shouldn't say frilly, I should say sort of poetic phrase like Charles Eisenstein's, "The more beautiful world our hearts know is possible." It's quite poetic. It's can really stir up an imagining of, something quite wonderful and imaginary out on
Very
some.
seductive too.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I should just be fully, full disclosure here. I get very impatient with that phrase and with much of the new agey kind of, if we just put a little tweak on the new agey conversations that have been going on for 30, 40 years now, that, maybe we'll make a buck or two, or maybe we'll just, have some really good feel good weekends that we'll, have as workshops or something. My experience is that what you're sharing, that the horizons that you point out for us when you bring us your sharing in the conversation like this, you're not talking about a buzz phrase, poetic or not. You're sharing with us from a direct experience of being a human being that has done some extraordinary inner work to be able to directly experience, directly reference being alive in this moment with a remarkably fully opened eyes and senses, and a remarkable amount of, another phrase that I remember from your book, activated presence,
Right.
an activated presence. And so I'm curious if you could share with us, what's it like to be in that direct experience, just even on a day-to-day level, whatever you'd like to share, from not just being up on that ridge and seeing the horizon, but actually being immersed virtually on a daily basis in this extraordinarily heightened sense of being alive.
Yeah. Again, I can't even remember what I wrote about activated presence, because I've really become a living expression of those words. Like when I was writing those words a few years ago, they were intentions that were moving through me at that time, and they hadn't fully landed. And since putting the book out, it's just been a natural unfolding inside of me to become a living expression of those words. So like I said, the words on those pages are now alive within me. So to be able to articulate it now just is more, it's a little more challenging, because I'm not really thinking about it, I'm just living it. For me, I used to invest a lot more energy in exploring the minutia of collapse unfolding around the world, just exploring all of the different dots of crises that were forming an entirely new landscape all over this planet. And it just sent me into a tailspin of despair constantly. It really wasn't serving me. It wasn't enhancing my life in any way. And it wasn't, certainly, if it wasn't enhancing my life, it wasn't enhancing the lives of those around me that I care about and love.
Mm-hmm.
So I made a conscious decision to no longer invest in that anymore. The bottom line for me is I know that it's unfolding. I don't need to know the minutia.
Mm-hmm.
And so from that place, the next question that I ask myself is, how do I choose to live with this awareness? And the immediate answer is to live fully now. It's so simple. I mean, it sounds like one of those cliche new agey phrases. And I honestly can't think of another way of expressing it, but that's really all it is for me. It's about living fully now. And it comes back to, there's just this continual process, and I'm going to keep looping back to this process of letting go. To be able to live fully now is all about the continual process of letting go, the continual process of falling apart, the continual process of expanding and emerging from all of that. So activated presence for me really is about waking up every morning and allowing each moment to just naturally unfold on its own. Because I've created my life now very consciously with this collapse awareness now to be present rather than to invest myself in working a job to sustain the the culture of business as usual. I'm not interested in trading time for money anymore. That doesn't mean that I'm independently wealthy. I seem to be able to manage. I don't know how. All I know is that I have an intention of living a certain way. And with that solid intention, my life unfolds in a way that allows for a sense of ease without committing myself and selling myself out, betraying myself, without betraying myself to a culture that I have no resonance with, that I have no desire to support in any way whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like the way to describe for me activated presence now would be, it would be kind of like, and this is not something that I explored in the book. This is a new exploration for me just recently. It's about really discovering, not finding, but really discovering home within myself. So I feel like the only way to make peace with the compromised state of the planet and our world is to really, really, really source that home within ourselves. So, because we're so trained to be externally referenced, where we generally think of home as some geographical location, or we even think that home is the planet itself. And I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about home entirely within ourselves. And I feel like one of the most profound examples of someone finding home within themselves was Viktor Frankl. This is a man who discovered home within himself while he was imprisoned in a Nazi concentration camp.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote one of the most profound books that is still life-giving to this day. And so, I mean, this is a guy who found home within himself in a Nazi concentration camp. So that says a lot.
Yes,
so,
it does.
Yeah. On that train of thought,
yeah.
when I talk about myself, this recent expansion crisis that I've undergone and I'm still emerging from, this has really brought me to a deeper state of home within myself. So when I talk about home, it's no longer somewhere outside of me that prompts the feeling of home within me anymore. Because I used to believe that Ottawa was my birth home and coastal British Columbia was my soul home. And the truth for me now is that discovering home within myself, I don't need to be anywhere special to inspire that feeling within me anymore.
Yeah.
So I can be present, activated in presence anywhere, feeling home within myself. And when I think about the beautiful places that I used to move to find that place within myself, like British Columbia, calling that my soul home, it really amounted to little more than a seductive external reference for what I still didn't know that I didn't already have inside of myself. So now that doesn't mean that those moments of wanting to run away don't still arise, because they do. I just had one a few days ago where, like, oh my God, I can't stand winter. I just want to run away. But really, it wasn't I can't stand winter. I couldn't stand myself in that moment. So whenever that feeling comes up inside of me now, and I want to just run away to somewhere beautiful and leave it all behind, I now know this is a red flag inside of myself that shows me that I've lost connection to myself as already being home. So, and the truth is, no matter how beautiful a place may still appear to be through our perceptual senses of eyesight, the entire planet, as you know, is in a state of massive compromise. So there's nowhere outside of myself where I can go that isn't already ailing anymore. And also where I won't feel that compromised energy because of my deep connection to the energy of the planet. And what I've also discovered in my own life is that there are many other ways that we attempt to externally source home within ourselves, which ultimately is a distraction from going into that place within ourselves that leads to that activated presence. So in my own life, that would be creative endeavors and relationships. And I know those both well. But the way I now see it, it all amounts to the same thing. So if I can't discover and sustain home within myself, I'm not going to be able to find that anywhere else or with anybody else. And I will most likely live in that perpetual state of grief and despair, and I'll feel somewhat lost. So I'm just going to keep on running here unless you have something to say.
I'm good. You go as long on this thread as you'd like.
Okay. This is a big one for me. This is because this is, like I said, this is a recent exploration for me.
Yeah.
Until I discovered home within myself, and not home outside of myself provoked by a beautiful place outside of myself, like when I lived in coastal BC, not home outside of not home inside of myself provoked by creative endeavors and meaningful outcomes outside of myself, like when I did the podcast and my blog and my books, and not home inside of myself provoked by being in the presence of others who are walking the same path, but home inside of myself, wherever I am, when I'm doing absolutely nothing and when I'm completely alone.
Yeah.
And when I felt perfectly comfortable in that, I could feel this overwhelming sense of pure presence. And there is an activated quality to that because it's so profound. There's not really language for it. Yeah. And in that, I knew that I'd finally landed. And it's when I finally felt like I'd landed, I knew that I'd arrived at home within myself. And in this arrival into a more expanded place of wholeness, I no longer feel any need to travel anymore or run away, which is a common thread for me. I feel no need to create or to do or to be anything special anymore. Mm-hmm. And I also have no need to be with anyone outside of myself to feel complete within myself anymore. So if I have great people in my life like you, Dean, you are just a bonus that just enhances my life.
Yeah.
So what that ultimately means in this place of presence is that I can now find beauty, the beauty of the places that used to be so meaningful for me, like the ocean in coastal BC. I can find that inside of myself because that's where it lives. And I can now find the sense of purpose and meaning that the books and the podcasts and the blog used to provide for me inside of myself because that's where it lives. And I can now find the connection of meaningful relationship. And this one's really important for me inside of myself because that's where it lives. So all of the feelings that those external references once provoked inside of me are no longer required, because I've discovered that I'm already all of that. And as I continue to go through these expansion crises, I'm so much more.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, like, it's a real place of freedom. And I guess that would be an expanded way of really speaking about activated presence for me now. If I was to rewrite that chapter, I would, which I may do, you never know. And I would definitely weave a lot of this, these concepts, these new emerging thoughts into that chapter, because it's big.
Yeah.
Hey, when you ask me to play ball, I play big.
Oh, I love it. That's perfect. It's perfect. Thank you. You know what was sparked for me when you were saying this last piece? Again, a long, long time ago, I was introduced to a phrase that I'm sure we've all heard a bunch, and perhaps we've somehow integrated it in a good way in our lives, and perhaps we've just let it be another of the 1,000 little quippy quotey things that we are amused by from time to time. And that's an expression called "It's a good day to die."
Mm.
And I heard that, I want to say early teens, I heard it the first time. And it was pretty profound. You know, it was in probably a film or in a book. And I remember being moved by it. I remember stopping and thinking, that's something. I don't quite know, because it was beyond my capacity to really get my head around at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And somehow I was reminded of that phrase when you revisited letting go a number of times using different words in this last stretch of what you were just saying. It reminded me, or it sparked in me, that set of anchors or reference points in my own experience that I go to let go in a moment,
Mm-hmm.
of the kind of externally referent anchoring moments that I'm doing my best to dissolve my attachment with them
Mm-hmm.
from the outside world. And there's one little process or one little point of that helps me dissolve those attachments. And it has something to do with, it's almost like I hit a button and there's a recording saying, this is a good day to die.
Mm-hmm.
This is a good moment to die. And oddly, I'm sharing it to for the folks who might be watching this as something of I don't really want to say it's a practice. It is just it's literally a touch point within my experience where I'm feeling this attachment, and it's being a little stubborn. I don't know quite how to have it dissolve in a good way so that it no longer has that grip attached to it. And there's literally a touching, an energetic touching that I do of this spot. I really don't have language for it, so I'm doing my best. And so when I notice that attachment, and I can recall that there's a way of activating a particular motion inside my system that can help to dissolve that connection. And it comes from a warmth. It comes from something similar to that little warm ember that we were talking about before with grief.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost like having that warm ember of honoring the moment. Like, this is a good moment to die. And the part of me that's dying in that moment is the part of me that really still wants to hold on. Is that making sense?
Yes, and that's the painful part right there, is the holding on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so the good moment to die is what really allows me to go.
Wow, you make
So,
that seem so easy.
in that moment, it often is, but they don't all have to be painful and hard.
Yes, you're right. You're
But I
right.
can say that now. There were decades during which, no, it was pretty painful and hard. But that's me. Yeah. Deb, I feel this conversation, the envelope of the conversation, energetically coming to a close, and I'm so appreciative of this, just the ease and the generous and easy exchange, and I so appreciate it. It's so generous of you to spend this time and do this sharing with me and us. And I'm curious if there's anything that you're inclined to wrap up with. That, do you have anything that you could just share, sort of heart to heart, with someone who might be new to this path? They get a sense that the world is deeply troubled, and the way that we've all grown up in this world has been so beyond problematic, and they've got a sense of there has to be something beyond this to reach for, to walk to, on some kind of a path, and they don't see a path yet. And can you reach back in your experience and just share anything from your experience to offer them a different view for a moment?
Well, yeah. My, for lack of a better term, my spiritual path really began in 2010, I would say. Like, my mother passed away, and I had a very close relationship with her, and it was a really, I don't need to get into the story of it, but it was very impactful for me. And that was when I first discovered that it was a good day to die. And I went through my first dark night of the soul a couple of years later, and the emergence from that is what really provoked this hunger to know myself more. Because through going through the darkness of all of that and coming out the other side, I felt a greater wholeness. I didn't know if I was going to come out the other side, because when I was in it, it just felt like this wall of darkness that just continually kept converging on me, and I could not see any way out. But I stuck with it, and I came out, and then I started to just really tap into my intuitive self and just follow the impulses that were providing me with insight to go here, do this, talk to this person, blah, blah, blah. And I would just, none of it made sense, but the feelings inside of me were so powerful that I couldn't negate them, or I probably could, but I just chose not to, because I've generally, since I was a child, I've always lived a pretty intuitive life. So, I read so many books. I went to so many workshops. I did so many retreats. And I felt like, for the most part, a lot of the books and the retreats and all that stuff would take me to this place. It felt like this glass bubble that I was in. And I could see this infinite space beyond the glass bubble. And these experiences that I had would take me right to the edge, and I would have my nose pressed against the glass, but I couldn't get through to the other side. And I wanted to get to the other side, and it didn't matter what it took. That's where I wanted to be. And in 2013, a friend of mine introduced me to the work of Louise Lebrun, and my life changed from there. Mm-hmm. She not only took me to the other side, she shattered that entire glass bubble. And that changed my life. Mm-hmm. And it's really, for me, it's really difficult to articulate any kind of a path or any kind of a how with her work, because it's so organic. And I believe now that that's what makes it so potent, is that there's not a recipe for it, because it's so individual. Getting another cat, it's getting close to feeding time, so they're all starting to hover around me now. Mm-hmm. But it was discovering Louise's work, and then just the resonance for me was immediate. And prior to that, I'd gone to a number of experiences at the Monroe Institute in Virginia. And that was all about expanding consciousness. So through my own experiential processes there, I knew in myself what Louise put language to. I knew myself as the God force. That's her language for it. I'd already experienced that, but she took it so much further. So just I took to her work like that, and just instantly immersed myself in it. Mm-hmm. Got to know her as a friend. And my first book, Unplug, I had wanted to be an author for years and years and years, and always had this self-limiting belief that I couldn't do that. And then through all of this, I'm like, yes, I can do anything. And so I decided to just follow the internal calling inside of myself to interview people who had walked this path and who had had significant transformation in their lives. And Louise was one of the people that I reached out and wrote her story in this book. And that's really when we became friends. And at that time I had my podcast. And so I had her on one podcast, and everything that came out of that woman's mouth was just profound. It's just like, I'm always mesmerized when I hear her speak. And so then it was another podcast, another podcast, another podcast. And then, I haven't done her decloaking, and she has a number of experiences, a progression that she invites people to engage in. And although I haven't actually done any of the typical format experiences, I had a relationship with Louise in that I created customized experiences for myself that for me were incredibly potent. I suspect that being in a program room would be, I can't say whether it would be more or less, but I just know for myself that it was transformative.
Yeah.
So for me, that was really, you're asking about the path, the thing that really shot me through into another realm, into an entirely different paradigm, and into a much more comfortable expression of who I am in the world now. And it was all through Louise's work. Mm-hmm. So I highly, highly recommend that anybody who's even a tiny bit curious about exploring this path, there's no need to take the long, laborious route like I did. You don't have to read all the books and do all that. If I had known about Louise right from the get-go, I would have gone would have been a straight shot to her work. And then I wouldn't have invested thousands of dollars on stuff that just took me to the edge of that glass bubble.
Right.
Instead, I would have had myself a lot sooner. But hindsight, right? Mm-hmm. So I just read her blogs, listen to her interviews, just engage in her work, get to know get to know what she offers. Like, honestly, that was it for me. And you know, I've been really fully engaged in her work for a number of years, and I finally reached a point recently where I feel so solid in myself that, you know, I've kind of say like I've moved out of the house.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Well, just for folks who are watching this particular section of the Hope series, as with all of my many podcast interviews with many of the practitioners and even course leaders and so on from this work of Louise Lebrun, the Well systems and decloaking and code model and so on, I'll be putting all the needed information to access the books and other interviews and other materials that could fill in the picture that Deb's describing here of one potentially potent access to a very different level of engagement with how to be a human being in these extraordinary times. I also want to mention that the vast majority of people who participate, you know, except for the possible, you know, reading books and perhaps listening to audio material, the vast majority of participants, in fact, all the participants are women. And so for the men in the crowd, those who identify as male, I will also be providing some materials, some access, some information for other, I think, comparably deep, but very, very different methodologies that are also pretty potent for giving us access to another level of engagement, another level of how we can experience life in a truly new and extraordinary way. So I just wanted to mention that because you mentioned Louise, you mentioned her work, and as always, I will put lots of information in the show notes and in other elements of this online learning series to give folks access. Deb, anything else?
I think we've covered a lot of ground here, Dean.
Yeah, me too.
So yeah, that was, and again, I really, really appreciate your willingness to flow.
Mm-hmm.
No agenda.
Yeah. Really exciting times. It looks like 2020 might be a possibility for me to somehow meet y'all in person, some number of y'all from that lineage and up there in the Canadian world. I'm not quite sure how, but it looks like there's some possibilities. So I will keep you posted and we'll see if there's a way to somehow meet in person someday soon.
Well, be prepared for a big hug, Dean, because I feel like it's been a few years coming now.
All right, it's a deal. Deb Ozarko, thank you so much for contributing your gorgeous presence to this very heartfelt expression in the world, this living resilience, deep academy, library of learning series. I have great hopes that, all pun intended there, that if I can just get half the extraordinary contribution that you've been to this little series on hope, if I can just find half of this for any other of my learning series to come, I'm considering myself a very lucky person.
Thank you, Dean.
Have yourself a wonderful day out there.
You too.
Thank you, Deb.
Thanks, Dean.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Hey there. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive conversation with Deb Ozarko about hope. Hope it has been valuable for you, whether you're new to this conversation or you've been around the conversations about human-caused collapse for years. Again, just a reminder of where you'll find more of this kind of work if it interests you. And that is on the website livingresilience.net. And it'll be on the programs page, which is called Deep Academy. If you go there and you scroll down that Deep Academy page on the livingresilience.net website, you'll find what I called at the beginning, Living in Two Worlds. That's the introductory series. And what you'll also notice is that to sign up for any of these learning series, it's as simple as clicking on a button there, right there on the website page. You'll also notice that there are a number of pricing choices. What we're intending to do with every one of these Living Resilience Deep Academy offerings is to have them priced in a way that you can contribute if you are able and interested in doing so. And it is not at all a prerequisite to your participation. In other words, it's sometimes called a gift economy. If you have the ability, the resources, and the intention to do so, to contribute in a financial fashion to this project, thank you. And if you are unable or unwilling or not interested at this time, we still welcome your participation, and you can just click right through and participate in what may end up being the most important element of all in the Living Resilience Deep Academy offerings. We are putting together a series of online video Zoom call gatherings on the first and third Saturdays of every month in 2020. These gatherings are intended to be in standalone on their own learning experiences. So there will be some teaching pieces, there will be some seminaring, but most importantly, it'll be a chance for all of us to come together and to share about our own personal practices and to bring our own process, where we are in the process of facing and leaning into the human-caused collapse of Earth and human systems and the various stressors that can be happening at as huge as a global scale and as intimate as the very, very personal scale. Look forward to seeing you both participating in the online Deep Academy offerings, and even more importantly, to seeing you in those Saturday, first and third Saturday gatherings on a Zoom call. By the way, all of those calls will be recorded and be made available to anyone who's signed up for any of the Deep Academy offerings. Look forward to seeing you there.